Well, good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing the Passport Learning Outcomes and Proficiency Criteria for Human Cultures. I'm Kate Springsteen, Project Coordinator of Member and Education Services for Interstate Passport. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at www.wiche.edu/passport/webinars by tomorrow, March 31st. If you have questions throughout the webinar, type your question into the box on the GoToWebinar panel and it will be brought to the presenter's attention. Following this webinar, I will be sending out an email with information on where to find a recording of this webinar, as well as a link to a survey which we would very much appreciate if you would fill out. I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenters for today's webinar, Laura Vidler and Melissa McAllister. Laura is Professor of Spanish and Chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics at the University of South Dakota. She holds a PhD from the University of California, Irvine, and has published numerous studies on performance theory and drama of the Spanish Golden Age. Laura is a member of the Board of Directors of the Association for Hispanic Classical Theater. She is also founder and director of the Comedia Theater or Theory Institute Incorporated, a nonprofit organization that promotes performance and performance studies. She was previously professor and program director of Spanish at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Melissa served as Wyoming's faculty liaison for the Human Cultures Interstate faculty team. She has taught English as a second language for more than 15 years and is currently a faculty member at St. Petersburg College in Clearwater, Florida. Throughout her career in higher education, she has taken on roles that support student success through a variety of roles. Melissa has a BA in International Studies from Emory University and an MS in Teaching ESL and Applied Linguistics from Georgia State University. She is also a doctoral candidate in Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wyoming. Welcome, Laura and Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. Well, we're very excited to be here today to talk about the Human Cultures Goal Area and the Interstate Passport in general. And so for today's webinar, we're going to start by giving you a brief overview of the Interstate Passport, its purpose, what is it, some of the key components. And then we'll delve a little bit more into the Human Cultures Goal Area specifically, and a little bit about the process of how we developed the learning outcomes and the proficiency criteria for that area. And lastly, we'll talk about how you can become a member of the Interstate Passport Network and why we think it's a great idea. So let's get started. The purpose of the Interstate Passport, excuse me, the passport was designed to reduce the unnecessary repetition of academic work after a student transfers. So research has shown that students who transfer from one institution to another take longer to graduate, have lower graduation rates overall, and spend more money and time on their education. And so the passport, if we could just go to the next slide, is a program that advances the friction-free transfer from one institution to another, whether within a state or even across state lines. It was a grassroots initiative that was designed by faculty in states within the Western region. And what I think is most interesting about it, while it focuses on the lower division general education requirements, the transfer is based on learning outcomes rather than on specific courses. And that's really what makes it unique. So it's like a large articulation agreement across state lines, but based on learning outcomes instead of courses. The other unique thing about it is that it allows institutions to track student academic progress even when they leave your institution or even when they come from another institution. And just in the same way that the program itself was developed by faculty, the tracking progress has been designed by registrars and institutional researchers across the region.
Okay, this is Melissa. I'm going to talk a little bit about the interstate passport process and the components. And so The first thing that occurred in the development of the Interstate Passport was the selection of the Passport Lower Division General Education areas, and this was completed by the Passport State facilitators and the staff. Then the Passport learning outcomes for each area, each of the 9 areas, were developed by faculty. After those outcomes were developed, proficiency criteria, which provided suggestions for how to meet each Passport learning outcome, were again developed by faculty. And then lastly, once those outcomes and criteria were developed, the Passport blocks were developed by the faculty by sort of sorting courses based on which courses met the Passport learning outcomes for the particular Passport area. After that, after the Passport blocks were developed, the Passport then moves into the student's hands, and once they complete the 9 areas of the Passport, they earn a Passport, which allows them to transfer to other Passport institutions. And this entire, the movement of the student is actually tracked by the registrars in the institutional research offices of the participating institutions and states. So there are 9 general education areas that were developed from the LEAP ELOs and the WICHE research. And LEAP is the Liberal Education and America's Promise Initiative by the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Through this initiative, LEAP developed essential learning outcomes, and these form the basis for the 9 general education areas that were identified for the Interstate Passport. And WICHE is the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, and they conducted some research also to form this passport. So teams have met and agreed on the proficiencies and activities for each of the 9 areas, and we started with the foundational skills. And these are the skills that are necessary for students to be successful in college across any institution. So it's focusing on oral communication, written communication, and quantitative literacy. Next come the knowledge of concepts. And this includes a variety of disciplines, creative expression, natural sciences, human society and the individual, and of course human cultures, which is what we'll be talking about today in more detail. And lastly are the cross-cutting skills, which go across courses and don't belong just to a single course. And they could in fact include, this development of these skills could in fact include activities that occur outside of the classroom. So this refers to critical thinking and then teamwork and value systems. Next we're going to talk about how the PLOs and PC were developed for human cultures. Laura?
Great, thank you. So for each of these goal areas, there is a description, which you see on the screen for human cultures, and then a set of learning outcomes. And so I just want to start by going over the description of the human cultures goal area, and then we'll look a little bit more closely at the outcomes themselves, and then get into the process by which we developed them. So the human cultures goal is really very interdisciplinary. It's designed to get students looking at their own culture and comparing and contrasting with other cultures, thinking about the human condition. And the subject matter, of course, is going to include different disciplines. As you can see on the bottom, these are just some of the disciplines that were involved in the development of the goal area: history, anthropology, archaeology, political science, geography, ethnic studies, languages, etc. And so when we get into the actual learning outcomes themselves, we put, because there's 6 of them, they wouldn't all fit on one slide. So we're going to take a look at the first 3, and then we'll take a look at the second 3. And we start really at kind of the lower order of thinking. We're defining, identifying, and describing in these outcomes. So a student will be able to define and apply knowledge of changing human cultures by using core vocabulary, terminology, information, concepts, theories, and debates. They're going to be able to identify and describe past and current forms of inquiry into changing human cultures across time and place. So we're asking them to be able to look at, be able to identify different ways of studying human cultures. And then we're going to ask them to be able to research human cultures using relevant methodology. So being able to understand that there are different ways of researching these things and to be able to use something that they think is relevant. The second three outcomes get into a little bit more higher order analysis. So number 4, we're asking students to be able to examine identities, languages, beliefs, and behaviors of oneself and others as parts of a dynamic culture or culture. So this is where we really are beginning to get into the sort of compare and contrast, understanding that you are part of a culture and that other people are part of cultures as well, and how are they similar and how are they different. With number 5, we ask students to be able to demonstrate understanding, respect, sensitivity, and empathy when interacting with one's own or others' cultures. And this can happen either interpersonally or in an intellectual sort of academic engagement, for example, in a paper. With number 6, we ask students to be able to examine and explain the external, structural, and social elements influencing human cultures, including, and we have a series of different areas: class, race, ethnicity, age, language, gender, disability, sovereignty, sexual orientation, etc. And so those are the learning outcomes for the human cultures goal area. And now we want to let you know a little bit about how we arrived at those.
All right, so the first thing that we had to do when we came to develop the Passport Learning Outcomes is really understand what it was a learning outcome was and what we were supposed to be doing. So basically, we are trying to explain what a student should know and or be able to do, and it's similar to your course objectives, competencies, or outcomes. To develop the human cultures PLOs, we followed the process, which is sort of briefly outlined on the right side of your screen. We started in October of 2014 by pulling together state committees to brainstorm different suggestions for learning outcomes to identify what it was that the people in our individual states believed would show knowledge and understanding of human cultures and be able to meet the learning outcomes. So as the states did this, they compiled their own drafts of what learning outcomes they wanted, and then the state representatives, in this case I was representing Melissa, I was representing Wyoming, and Laura was representing South Dakota. We all came to Boulder, Colorado, and we created crosswalks and started to hash out how we wanted to, what we wanted the human cultures PLOs to look like, with everyone's contributions being considered. We ended our work, and this work occurred, in February of 2015. We ended our work in Boulder with a final version that we wanted to take back to our states, and we asked our states to review the draft PLOs that we came together with, and then we had some conference calls to finalize the language and just sort of wordsmith a little bit. So all of this occurred sort of October to February of 2015. And then we came together. We needed to start working on the proficiency criteria. So the proficiency criteria are the suggestions for how students demonstrate proficiency, which included suggestions of activities and assignments the students would do in class. And so the process to develop human cultures PCs were actually very similar to the process that we followed for the PLOs. This officially started at the same time that the state reps returned with the PLOs, and in February. So the PLOs were being revised and considered at the state level, while proficiency criteria were being brainstormed by each state. So in February, the state committee members met together, made their recommendations. In April of 2015, the state reps went to Boulder, and we worked together to sort of sort out how we could make sure that the criteria that we were sharing were representative of what we wanted our the participating institutions to understand, and to make sure that the proficiency criteria we were recommending were actually going to meet the passport learning outcomes. So after we met in April, we went back to our states. We had more committee reviews and then conference calls to finalize the Human Cultures PC. This occurred mostly in late April and early May, and then a little bit of work was done over the summer, but the majority of the work was finished by May of 2015. Now Laura's going to talk about our development of the Human Cultures PLOs.
Okay, thanks. So now that you've seen just a little bit of the timeline and the tasks and the process, I want to start talking a little bit more detail of how we got to the learning outcomes that we did. And so as Melissa said, each state developed a list of outcomes on their own, brought them to Boulder to create this crosswalk document that I'm going to show you in a minute. And then we worked together to sort of compare and pull together from the different states to the outcomes that we ended up with at the end. And so on the next slide, we have an example of, this is actually just page 1 of the crosswalk document, and you can see it probably goes on, I can't remember, maybe 5 or 6 pages. And this is like a legal size sheet of paper. And across the sheet, you see a column that represents each of the states that were participating in the Human Cultures Learning Outcome Development. And so each column has a list of all of the states' outcomes that they developed on their own. This crosswalk, so the first task really with this crosswalk was to read it, right? Because each of us only came with a familiarity with the outcomes that we had developed in our own state. So we got to read this document, which was really fascinating. And the first thing really, the second thing I guess, was really to find commonalities, right? And there were lots, but to look at the major areas where people had similar things in common. And a lot of it was like, oh, I really like the way Utah worded this, or I like North Dakota's explanation of that. So we were able to pull from these different texts and articulations of different outcomes for the areas in which we had in common. And then it was a little bit looking at some of the outliers. And some of the outliers were outliers because they were outliers, but others were because, oh, maybe my state didn't think about that, and that's really important. Some of that had, because of the interdisciplinary nature of this particular goal area, you know, there's faculty from all different disciplines. I think Melissa and I were the only language people in all of the states, and so language was an outlier in this case because South Dakota had put it in, but other states hadn't necessarily put it in, and so we found ways to get it in there. And so I think that the representation from a variety of states, from diverse disciplines, was really important, and we were able to work together on this. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this crosswalk, you may notice at the top in red letters, it has the name of the content area as Evolving Human Cultures instead of just Human Cultures, which is what it is now. This was actually really the very first point of discussion. People asked, okay, well, why are we using the word evolving? And we bantered this about a little bit. You know, we were concerned that evolving would imply some sort of progress from, you know, bad to best, and that was a controversial idea. And so we ended up convincing everyone to eliminate the word evolving and just use human culture. So these are the kinds of discussions that we were having throughout. And we go to the next slide, I think.
Okay. And so after we developed the passport learning outcomes and sort of finalized those, we followed the same process as I mentioned earlier for the performance criteria as for the PLOs. But our discussion was, it was interesting. I think after we had wrestled with the PLOs, we sort of thought the performance criteria will be super easy. We'll go in, we'll throw our suggestions in there, and then we're done. But it actually was a little bit more challenging to establish the PC than it was the PLO. So our discussion focused on brainstorming assignments, aligning assignments with individual PLOs, providing additional explanatory language, ensuring disciplinary coverage, including a variety of assessment modalities, and formatting the document. And so I'm going to sort of touch on each of these points on this next slide that is the first page of the Human Cultures Passport Learning Outcomes and Proficiency Criteria. So one of the things that we did, if you look at the top right of the screen, you'll see the proficiency criteria, and then underneath there's a little note that starts with NB. We felt that it was important to provide additional explanatory language to emphasize that the list of potential assignments that are detailed in our PLOs and proficiency criteria for human cultures were examples only. They were not requirements. Sample activities came from different disciplines, they span multiple learning outcomes, and they could cover a range of formats. And so we also thought it was important, because of our discussions about foreign language, to note that proficiency could be demonstrated in a language other than English. So that was one of the first things that we sort of really wrestled with. Another thing that we struggled with was aligning assignments with individual PLOs. And so we sort of thought, well, you know, some of these assignments, they definitely fit with the first passport learning outcome, but they might also fit with one or two others further down. So the way that we addressed that particular challenge is that there's a dashed line that is between the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria that we felt sort of represented a membrane that some of these assignments could sort of move between the passport learning outcomes. They weren't tied only to these particular outcomes, because we realized that if we tried to place even just this sample of assignments in front of, into each potential learning outcome that it could apply to, that our section on the PLOs and PC for human cultures would probably be 20 or 30 pages long, and we still would not necessarily have satisfied the distribution of those assignments across the learning outcomes. So we tried to place the assignments where we thought they would most definitely fit, and then leaving it open with this dashed line to say, well, you might find that this also meets another learning outcome further down in the document. So on that note, we are going to move on to some of the sample courses for human cultures. I worked at Laramie County Community College in Wyoming, and after the passport learning outcomes were developed and then the proficiency criteria were developed, the next step was to determine the courses that would fulfill the passport block for human cultures. Here's a sample of some of the courses for Laramie County Community College. So Cultural Diversity in America, Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, Art History 1, Global Economic Issues. In South Dakota, at Dakota State University, some of their sample courses that fall under the umbrella of human cultures is Introduction to Human Geography, Introductory Spanish 1, History of World Art 1, and U.S. History 1. Again, these are just sample courses. The full passport blocks can be found at the link that is at the bottom of the slide. So if you want to see what all of the participating institutions have determined fit, which courses fit within human cultures, you can go to that link and explore and have a good time seeing what's out there. All right, Laura.
All right, thanks, Melissa. Well, you're probably sitting there listening, and you probably have a lot of questions right now. We're going to give you a chance to ask some specific ones in a minute, but I do want to address a few of the frequently asked questions that we got as we went back and forth to our home campuses and began sharing and getting feedback on all of the learning outcomes and proficiency criteria throughout the development process. Some of these represent just some general concerns, and I think that the Interstate Passport has a lot of great answers for these that I want to share with you. So I think one of the important concerns is about institutional identity. So if we're going to have this articulation agreement that goes across states and even across state lines, you know, how can my institution maintain its own unique identity? Well, I think what's beautiful about the Interstate Passport is that it's really based on learning outcomes, not based on courses. So if your institution has a really robustly developed first-year experience, for example, or if they have a required study abroad, or if you have special honors courses for the introductory level, all of those things can still be maintained. You're just going to take them and put them in the buckets, right? So you get to decide, your institution and your faculty get to decide which courses outcomes are congruent with the passport outcomes and can fit in your human cultures bucket, for example. So there's really no problem with institutional identity. I think faculty were also really concerned with maintaining rigor in the general education curriculum. And this was actually a real concern of ours as we developed these outcomes. So remember that the outcomes and proficiency criteria were developed by faculty in the trenches, where, you know, Melissa and I are out there teaching every day. And so we're also concerned with this. I think one of the, a good example of this was with the outcome on demonstrating empathy, right? We struggled a little bit with that. Can we ask students to demonstrate empathy, or can we only ask to have them demonstrate that they understand that empathy is a good thing, right? Those are two different things. And I think we struggled a little bit with, you know, how do you assess if a student is being empathetic, right? And I think once we got over the hurdle that empathy can be demonstrated in an intellectual engagement, it doesn't have to be an interpersonal engagement, like an actual conversation between me and somebody from another culture, that conversation can be an intellectual one in an assignment on paper. And once we got over that hurdle, you know, I think we felt very strongly that we wanted to take that more rigorous step of having them demonstrate empathy. Another concern is this idea that somebody's telling me what to do in my classroom, right? Top-down curriculum development. And sometimes that happens from a reading of the proficiency criteria when people think that I have to do these assignments. And this also speaks to bullet number 4 there. Those proficiency criteria are merely suggestions of the kinds of assignments that faculty are using in classrooms right now across the country to assess these outcomes. I actually got a lot of good ideas from reading other people's proficiency criteria. I thought, oh man, I think I might implement that in my class next semester. So I would encourage you to read all those proficiency criteria, but they're just suggestions. Probably most of the assignments that you're already doing in your classrooms now can serve the same purpose. From a logistical standpoint at the state level, the only thing that a faculty member has to do now is to think about whether their courses might fit in one of these goal area buckets, right? So probably a committee on campus made up of faculty will do the initial alignment, right, of which usually starting with the gen ed courses that are already in place on your campus, right, or in your system. But faculty members could always petition to have their course fit in one of these buckets, really by simply looking at the outcomes of their courses, that it's a transfer level lower division course, and get it into the bucket if that's something that you want to do. And then from there, the passport is really administered at the registrar and institutional research level in terms of awarding passports and tracking students as they transfer in and out of a particular institution. I think the most frequently asked question that I got was, okay, so how is this going to be good for us? And usually what's behind that is enrollment, right? People are, when they ask that question, they're generally thinking about, are we going to get more people transferring in as we will who transfer out if we become a passport institution? And I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question per se, but in terms of, you know, what's good, there's a lot of good that comes from this particular program. In the first place, it's great for students, right? As we talked about earlier, students who transfer generally right now generally take longer to graduate. Sometimes they definitely have lower graduation rates overall, and they definitely spend more money and they spend more time. So for students, this is going to be great because they'll be able to take that passport from one institution to another and not have to worry about specific course requirements at the gen ed level at the new institution. But it's also really good for institutions because when students graduate at higher rates, the overall institutional graduation rate is higher. So that's a positive. And we'll also be able to track students who transfer out from our institution, whether or not they finish. So right now, if they transfer out, they just count as somebody who didn't graduate, but they may actually graduate somewhere else, and we'll be able to track that and count that as a graduated student. Overall, there's just going to be improved data. We'll just know more about who's finishing and how they're doing. We'll be able to track success at the next level. So how are passport students doing in comparison to non-passport students when they transfer? We'll be able to track that data. So anyway, those are, and of course, more graduated students is just good for society, right? We're going to have more people who are educated. It's better for society, it's better for democracy, it's better for the economy. And the last question that I think we get most often is, can you do a partial interstate passport transfer? That is, if I complete 4 of the passport blocks at one institution, can I bring those to another passport institution? And right now the answer to that is no. The passport block needs to be transferred as a complete block, in part so that we can assess best the success of passport students. And so that's the reason behind that. Okay, so for the faculty, we just talked about all the benefits for the students in the institution, but the Interstate Passport really has actual benefits for the faculty themselves. And I can say for myself that participation in the development of the Interstate Passport for human cultures has been really an incredible professional development opportunity for me. It's while my courses had outcomes before, and I was tracking them for language proficiency and that sort of thing based on my national organization. This really gave me a broad perspective of learning outcomes at the general education level and seeing what other states were doing and how they were thinking about this was really amazing. We also had just great conversations across disciplines. That was the other thing, is the cooperation across disciplines was phenomenal. I thought we got along really well and learned a lot from each other. And so we were able to go back to our campuses and discuss the Interstate Passport in ways that I think I wasn't able to before. And so those of us who worked on it will be able to help our institutions select courses to go in the blocks. We'll be able to mentor other faculty as they develop new courses that may fit in the lower division passport block areas. And it's I really feel like it's been a good thing for everyone. Well, at this point, we want to just briefly pause to see if anyone has any questions for us at this point.
Thanks, Laura and Melissa. I do have a question. The question is, as states and institutions join from outside the WICHE region, will there be any consideration for reviewing or possibly editing the passport learning outcomes?
Okay, that's a great question. So right now, the learning outcomes from all the goal areas are set, and I think, Kate, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but set to be reviewed on a 3-year cycle. So after 3 years, there'll be an opportunity to relook. And even now, like I look at them and I think, I actually have some ideas too about different learning outcomes and things that I, would like to add. So yes, I think that is true.
Yep, that's right. Pat, did you want to add anything to that? Maybe talk about the Passport Review Board's role in that at all? Pat? Oh.
You lost Pat?
A representative from each of the states and some at-large members. And their role is to look at the results of the tracking data that comes back from the various institutions is aggregated to provide an overview of the passport program. So if they were to see, for example, that students are not performing well after transfer in a particular area of learning associated with the learning outcomes, then they might want to call that team, that interstate team, back together earlier. Otherwise, it will work as Laura explained, on a 3-year rotation.
Thanks, Pat. I do have another question, and it's a clarification for the proficiency criteria. Does there need to be one assignment per PLO?
No, there doesn't need to be one assignment per PLO, but the main criteria is that we would expect that there would probably be a handful, at least, of assignments because it's unlikely that you would find a single assignment that could cover all 6 of the PLOs for human cultures in one time.
Great, thanks. And that's, that's just really up to the institution and faculty there to decide how they are actually teaching and imparting these learning outcomes. Before we move on, I have a question for you, Laura and Melissa, and I'm wondering if you could just talk about some possible challenges that the two of you faced in when you went back to your home institutions and talked about the Boulder meeting and how you worked out your talking with your home faculty, what they thought about the learning outcomes in PC when you brought them back there, and any challenges you might have faced at your home institutions.
Well, this is Laura. I think the biggest challenge is always a general resistance to assessment overall, mm-hmm. Right? So sometimes faculty feel as if assessment can sometimes be an exercise in futility, right? That that it's just more paperwork and nothing really happens because of it, or maybe it's, there's, oversight over, what I'm doing in my classroom or whatever. And so, I just had this conversation yesterday with my faculty, and we had a department meeting. We have a new tool on our campus that tracks data and assessment goals. And, so I always try to say, have you ever taught your class the same way twice? No, we're always trying to find new ways to get through to students and do new things. And this is just a way of measuring what it is that we're trying to do. So I try to, talk about assessment, in a very positive and sort of inspirational way. This is a way that we can show that we're constantly improving and doing new things, and that our students are coming out doing what we hope that they can do, that they will be able to do at the end. So that's probably, I think, the biggest challenge for me is just sort of a general resistance to assessment and helping the faculty to understand why we're assessing learning outcomes in the first place.
This is Melissa. We had, at Laramie County Community College, we had been actually wrestling with assessment and really actively making strides to have institutional competencies, and which are called outcomes or objectives in other places, depending on where you are. And so we had most of our faculty at that point, by the time we met for to write the PLOs and PC, we're pretty comfortable on the assessment side. I will say that within my group that I worked with human cultures, one of the things that I found is when I came back with our draft of the PLOs, a couple of the faculty members were disappointed that some of their favorite draft PLOs that we submitted to the crosswalk that we shared you earlier were not included, and there were some things. It was a moment of compromise, of recognizing that this was an effort to provide something that would work well across states, and it didn't mean that they had to change their course competencies just because we have the passport learning outcomes. And so so managing that disappointment, I think, was probably one of the greatest challenges. And then when we did have to meet for the PC, we had time issues, both in terms of getting together to prepare our brainstorm draft that I would take to Boulder in early April, and then of course when we came back for revisions, most of my colleagues that I was working with were like, "This is really great, but we don't have time to meet. We don't have time to think about this because it's the end of the semester," and I think that was something that we all encountered. As we were trying to, for all of the states, as we tried to figure out how we wanted to finalize our PC after our meeting in April, because everyone was on a different schedule. So those are challenges that we faced in Wyoming.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, you guys. I don't have any more questions right now, but if you do have a question, write it into the box on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will have another section like this at the very end where your question can be brought to Laura and Melissa's attentions.
Okay, so I think next we're going to look at how to become an Interstate Passport Network member and some reasons why we think that you should. So why become an Interstate Passport institution? It facilitates transfer both for the student and for the institution, right? So it eliminates major obstacles to transfer student success. For the student, they have to repeat fewer courses, they have to spend less money, they have to spend less time. But it also facilitates the transfer for the institution because the block transfers as a whole block, and there's no need for review of individual courses through articulation agreements in that way. The passport focuses on quality, right? So we're focused on outcomes. we have confidence that when the student completes the passport, that they can do what the passport says they can do. And it also generates data. So the data will help us track students' success, and it will also help us, as Pat was saying, to go back and revise. We're assessing our own assessment, right? So to revise, possibly revise outcomes in the future, or to look at how the passport is working to make adjustments. And we'll have the data to show and support the reasons to do that. And most of all, the Interstate Passport really is an effort to adapt to the changing landscape of higher education. There's really been a cultural shift in recent years in terms of how the public views the importance of and the reasons behind higher education. Why we educate is changing, how we educate is changing, and the Interstate Passport embraces these cultural shifts and is really just attempting to facilitate completion for the benefit of the student, the families, the institutions, and society. And the other thing I think is really interesting is that, as Melissa did allude to this earlier, that the passport has the capacity to include educational experiences that are not founded in courses. For example, just an example that comes to mind, possibly in the creative expression goal area. There are plenty of extracurricular experiences, like if a student participates in a student-run a cappella group that travels around and competes. That could easily fulfill some of the outcomes of the creative expression goal, even though it's not specifically course-based. And I think that it's really one of the first places that is trying to capture the totality of the higher education experience that doesn't strictly happen in the classroom. Okay, so how do you become a member of the Interstate Passport Network? Well, there are several steps, and the first thing that you really need to do is, after this webinar, go back, look at the resources that are on the WICHE website to look at the learning outcomes and review them and compare them to your institution's general education learning outcomes. And what you're really looking for is congruence. It doesn't have to be identical, and your institution does not have to adopt the Interstate Passport learning outcomes. It's just that your institution's outcomes need to be consistent with and not in conflict with the passport learning outcomes. So once you've determined that that is true, you can begin thinking about constructing your institution's passport block. And so all that means is to look at all, I would recommend starting with the general education courses you already have at your institution, and look at the learning outcomes for those courses, compare them to the learning outcomes of the passport, and begin taking courses and putting them in those blocks or bags to construct your passport block. And then after you have constructed your passport block, then you'll apply for passport status and sign the memorandum of agreement. The application is online and can be accessed at www.wiche.edu/passport/membership. So you can have a look at that as you're trying to make a decision about what you would like to do for your institution. Now, once your institution has applied and been accepted, you should begin to inform and advise students about the passport. So this doesn't really do any good unless the students know that it's there, right? And so in this step, you really want to get your marketing representatives involved, academic advisors, especially the professional advisors in your advising center involved, because you're really dealing with freshmen and sophomores, maybe they haven't even declared a major yet at all. So you want to make sure that everybody is informed and aware of the Interstate Passport. That's pretty critical. Then your institution will begin awarding the passport. At this point, you need to obviously get your registrar and your institutional researcher on board. There's training available for them so that they can understand how to evaluate and award the passport, and then also how to evaluate a passport that comes in from a transfer student. And then lastly, your institution will begin tracking the academic progress of passport students. The Interstate Passport is collaborating with the National Student Clearinghouse to make this step as easy and efficient as possible. On the next slide, I want to show you a worksheet that we have provided to facilitate the creation of the passport block. So this particular worksheet is from the human cultures, since that's what we're talking about today. And of course it has the description across the top. And then it has the learning outcomes. This is just page 1 of it, so those 6 learning outcomes, but it has the learning outcomes down the left column. And then across the top in those boxes, you can pencil in courses that you have on your campus, right? Possibly starting with some courses that are in the general education program already, or possibly thinking about some additional courses that might also fulfill the learning outcomes. And then it has these blocks below where you can check to see, okay, does that course meet this outcome? Yes, yes, yes. And so you'll want courses that have check marks all down the whole column that meet all of the learning outcomes in order to place it in your passport block.
Okay, so earlier, Laura had talked about the concern that some faculty had of that the Interstate Passport would actually dumb down the curriculum. And the Interstate Passport team recognized that this was going to be quite a concern, so they have instituted numerous ways to ensure passport quality assurance. So the first thing is that a minimum grade of C must be earned in all courses in the Interstate Passport block. So, so for those 9 general education areas, for the courses that fulfill those general education areas, they need to have a C or higher in order to earn the Interstate Passport. The next way that passport quality assurance is being taken care of is they are tracking, the Interstate Passport team is tracking student progress after transfer through the National Student Clearinghouse. There is a passport review board that is monitoring the Interstate Passport's efficacy through the use of this data from the National Student Clearinghouses. There's also an evaluation research study of the Interstate Passport's impact. This is being conducted by the Education Employment Research, CTR, at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. And finally, there is a pilot where certain states are mapping assignments to the passport learning outcomes. So Colorado, Montana, and New Mexico are working with NCHEMS, which is the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, to map the assignments that are being used to fulfill the passport learning outcomes. So I think it's pretty clear from this list and sort of the efforts that we've shared with you that the quality of the Interstate Passport is probably primary in this effort to make sure that students can transfer across state lines with and across institutions with minimal loss of course credits. So there are a lot of resources available for you to learn more about the Interstate Passport. You can access the resources by going to www.wiche.edu/passport/interstate_passport_components. And there you're going to find the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria, as well as information about how to construct your institution's passport block. So with that, we would like to open it up to other questions you may have about the Interstate Passport or about human cultures.
Well, thanks, Melissa and Laura again. So I have a question, and I'm actually going to call on Pat to join us. And the question is, can you give some more details about how the tracking will work?
I certainly can, Kate. The tracking process, there are really two components, and this operates through the National Student Clearinghouse, these two new services that will be offered to institutions participating in the Interstate Passport Network. The first is called Passport Verify, and the way that works is exactly the way Degree Verify works for institutions today. So at the end of each term, institutions report students who have earned a degree at their institution, and now they will also report students who have earned a passport. That enables registrars at other institutions where they have incoming transfer students to submit a list to the clearinghouse of incoming transfer students and find out immediately which students have earned a passport at another institution, where and when. The second service is called the Academic Progress Tracking Service, and in that service institutions will report the grades and the GPA, a number of credits for students who have earned the passport at their institution for at least 2 terms after earning the passport. For transfer students, they will report that information for at least 2 terms after transfer. All of that information is reported. It's de-identified, so all of that information is reported about students at the student level, and NSC will do all of the sorting and the calculations, aggregation, to provide reports back to the sending institution saying this is how how well your students performed 1 term after transfer or 2 terms after transfer compared to students who were transferred without a passport and compared to native students, so that institutions can use that for continuous improvement processes. And then I think I described earlier about the oversight report that the Passport Review Board will receive that will allow it to see how effective is the passport program overall across the network.
Great. Thanks, Pat. I don't have any other questions at this point in time. I want to thank Laura and Melissa again for your great presentation, and thank everybody who attended this webinar, and anybody who's listening later on. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Yep.
Thank you, Kate.
Mm-hmm.